It was the most controversial wildlife experiment America had ever attempted, and it started with just 31 animals. On January 12, 1995, in the first wolf reintroduction in Yellowstone's history, 3 packs captured in Canada were released into the Lamar Valley. No wolf had lived in Yellowstone for 70 years. The ranchers who had fought the decision for decades watched in fury. The scientists who had pushed for it watched in hope. But what those 31 wolves did next, with nothing but instinct, hunger, and the geometry of fear, would not just reshape the elk population, it would change the course of actual rivers. And nobody saw it coming. Securing permission to bring wolves back to Yellowstone took longer than the wolves had been gone. The Endangered Species Act of 1973 technically required the reintroduction, but the legal requirement and the political reality were 2 different things. Ranchers in Wyoming, Montana, and Idaho had fought the return of wolves with lawsuits, legislative pressure, and the kind of sustained fury that comes from watching a predator you believe your grandparents were right to eliminate get invited back in. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service spent 20 years navigating that opposition. Environmental impact statements, public comment periods, congressional hearings, legal challenges that went to federal court. The documentation generated by the process filled rooms. When the first 14 wolves finally landed at Yellowstone in January 1995, they had been flown in from Jasper National Park in Alberta, Canada, and held in 1-acre acclimation pens for 10 weeks before release. It was the culmination of a process so long and contested that the scientists involved described it less as a triumph than as an exhaustion. 14 wolves in 1995. 17 more in 1996. 31 animals total, divided into multiple packs, dispersed across the Lamar Valley and the Northern Range. Each wolf GPS tagged, ear tagged, and assigned a number. Their movements logged by Dr. Doug Smith and the Yellowstone Wolf Project team from day one. What those 31 wolves did next would take years to fully understand. The mechanism was not what anyone expected. The obvious prediction was that wolves would reduce elk numbers by hunting them. That happened. Elk numbers on the Northern Range declined from approximately 19,000 in 1995 to around 6,000 over the following decade. A significant reduction, though contested in its magnitude and cause, with hunting pressure and drought also playing roles. But the more important effect was not on how many elk there were, it was on where they went. Before the wolves arrived, elk had spent decades grazing freely along Yellowstone's rivers and stream banks, the valleys, the meadows, the edges where willows and aspens and cottonwoods grew, where the vegetation was lush and the ground was soft. They grazed those areas down to nothing, stripped the willows to nubs, kept the aspens from growing taller than a few feet. The riverbanks were bare and eroding. When the wolves arrived, the elk stopped using those places, not because they were being hunted there, but because they could be hunted there. A steep-sided valley with dense vegetation and limited escape routes is exactly the kind of place a predator can use. The elk's nervous systems understood this before their cognitive minds did. They changed where they grazed. They moved to higher, more open ground, where they could see what was coming. Scientists call this the ecology of fear. The change in elk behavior, not elk numbers, is what changed Yellowstone. The willows came back first. Along the banks of the Gallatin River, the Lamar River, the Soda Butte Creek, and the Blacktail Deer Creek, the places where elk had grazed the riparian vegetation to bare ground for 70 years, willows began growing, then aspens, then cottonwoods. Not dramatically at first, a few inches of new growth that the elk would have eaten the previous year, but now left alone. A 20-year study published in 2025 in the journal Biological Conservation found a roughly 1,500% increase in average willow crown volume in riparian areas of the Northern Range between 2001 and 2020. 1,500%. Willow crown volume, a measure of the total above-ground mass of willow growth, increased by a factor of 15 over 2 decades. The effect cascaded upward through the food web in ways that researchers had theorized but never witnessed at this scale. Songbirds returned to the willows. Species that had been largely absent from the Northern Range came back to nest in the thickened vegetation along the stream banks. The willow flycatcher, the yellow warbler. Population surveys documented species increases of several 100% in riparian zones within a decade of wolf reintroduction. Then the beavers. When the gray wolf was reintroduced into Yellowstone in 1995, there was exactly one beaver colony in the entire park. One. Doug Smith, the wildlife biologist who led the Yellowstone Wolf Project from its founding, documented this himself. By the time researchers published their findings years later, there were 9 beaver colonies in the park, with more establishing annually. The connection was direct. Willows are beaver food. Willows are also what beavers use to build dams. No willows meant no beavers. More willows meant more beavers. The wolves had not simply reduced elk numbers, they had unlocked an entire cascade of consequences that nobody had anticipated when the first crate was opened in the Lamar Valley. Here is where the rivers come in. The beaver dams changed the hydrology of Yellowstone's streams in ways that are still being documented. Beaver ponds slow water down. They hold it. They spread it across the floodplain. In doing so, they recharge the water table in the surrounding soil. That water would otherwise race downstream during spring snowmelt and be gone by summer. They create cold, shaded pools that salmon and trout require. They stabilize stream banks by raising the water table and keeping root systems hydrated year-round. But the bigger transformation was what growing vegetation did to the riverbanks themselves. The bare, eroding banks of Yellowstone's rivers, stripped by decades of elk grazing, had allowed the rivers to meander. Without root systems holding the banks in place, soil fell into the water constantly. Rivers widened and became shallow and warm. The channels shifted and braided across the valley floor. When the willows and aspens and cottonwoods grew back, their root systems stabilized the banks. Soil stopped falling into the rivers. The channels narrowed and deepened. The water moved faster and stayed cooler. In some sections of the northern range, researchers documented rivers literally changing their physical course, cutting deeper channels, abandoning old meanders, and reorienting toward configurations they had not occupied in decades. William Ripple and Robert Beshta at Oregon State University, who published the foundational research on Yellowstone's trophic cascade, described this as one of the most striking examples in ecological literature of a single species change, propagating through an entire landscape system. The scientific debate and why it matters. The trophic cascade story is real. The data on willow recovery, beaver expansion, songbird return, and streambank stabilization are documented in peer-reviewed literature spanning more than 2 decades. The 1,500% increase in willow crown volume is not an anecdote, it is a measurement. But the scale of the effect, particularly the claim that wolves single-handedly transformed Yellowstone's rivers, has been contested by ecologists who argue that climate variability, drought cycles, hunting pressure on elk outside the park, and the simultaneous recovery of grizzly bear populations all contributed to the changes observed. Dan McNulty, an ecologist at Utah State University, has stated directly, "What is not in doubt is whether a trophic cascade has occurred. What is debated is how strong the cascade is and to what extent wolves, specifically, are responsible compared to other variables. This distinction matters." The viral video, "How Wolves Change Rivers," which has accumulated over 45 million views, presents the trophic cascade as a near-complete transformation, driven almost entirely by wolf reintroduction. The peer-reviewed literature is more measured. Changes occurred. They are significant. The precise attribution of those changes is still being worked out by scientists who have spent their careers in Yellowstone. The story is true. It is not as simple as the most popular version of it suggests. The conflict that nobody resolved. Outside the park boundaries, the wolves did what wolves do. They dispersed. They established territories in the surrounding national forests and ranching lands of Wyoming, Montana, and Idaho. They found livestock. Between 1995 and 2015, wolves in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem were confirmed responsible for the deaths of approximately 2,000 cattle and sheep in the 3 states combined. The number sounds large. Spread across 20 years and 3 states, it represents a fraction of annual livestock mortality from disease, weather, and other predators. But it is not zero, and it fell on individual ranchers who had not chosen to participate in the rewilding experiment. The Federal Compensation Program, administered through a partnership between the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the nonprofit Defenders of Wildlife, paid out millions in livestock loss compensation over the program's duration. The payments helped. They did not eliminate the anger. Today, the wolf population in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem stands at approximately 500 animals, divided across roughly 60 packs. The political battle over their management, including delisting from Endangered Species Act protection, hunting seasons in Wyoming and Idaho, and challenges to those seasons from conservation groups, continues in federal courts and state legislatures. 31 wolves, 500 animals, rivers changed, birds returned, beavers building dams on streams that had no beavers in living memory, and a political argument that was never really about wolves, about what this land is for, who it belongs to, and what we owe to the processes that shaped it before we arrived, remains as unresolved today as it was on the morning the first crate opened in the Lamar Valley. The wolves did not wait for the argument to be settled. They just kept moving. Subscribe if this found you. Every week we cover the experiments, planned and unplanned, that are reshaping the American wilderness in ways the people who started them did not fully predict.